Welcome to Virtual Face-to-Face with Dr. Bruce Jarrell. I'm Alex Lukowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. America is woefully unprepared for a COVID-19 election. That's the headline from an in-depth exploration in Vanity Fair. And from the looks of things, they may be right. And Wisconsin Democratic National Committee Chairman Tom Perez says Republicans want to weaponize the pandemic by suppressing the vote with voter ID requirements and restrictions on mail-in and absentee ballots. In California, a judge has suspended an executive order from Governor Gavin Newsom that requires counties in that state to send mail-in ballots to all registered voters, as Republicans argue the governor is usurping legislative power. And here in Maryland, elected officials on both sides of the aisle have been sharply critical of how things have run. Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford called on state elections chief Linda Lamont, who stepped down after major problems with ballot printing, counting, and reporting. And Democrats like Baltimore's delegate Nick Mosby are calling long lines at the polls and accessibility issues a major problem. Add that to the challenges in registering voters in a time of social distancing and questions surrounding the upcoming political conventions, and you get the kind of mess that only a political expert like our guest today can even hope to unravel. Joining Dr. Jarrell today is Larry S. Gibson, the Morton and Sophia Mack Professor of Law here at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. Professor Gibson began managing political campaigns in Maryland with the 1968 election of Judge Joseph Howard and the 1970 elections of State's Attorney Milton Allen and Congressman Karen Mitchell. He was Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke's campaign manager in his successful elections in 1987, 91, and 95. In 1992, he was Maryland State Chairman of the Clinton-Gore presidential campaign. He's also served as the campaign consultant and political advisor to some African political leaders, including the former presidents of Madagascar and Liberia and the current president of Ghana. And as if that wasn't enough, and it certainly is, 2 weeks ago, Professor Gibson was elected to be a delegate for candidate Joe Biden at the Democratic National Convention, scheduled to be held in Milwaukee in August. Welcome, Professor Gibson.
Thank you for having me.
All right, two quick notes for the audience. First, this program is being recorded and will be posted on our COVID-19 webpage, umaryland.edu/coronavirus. And also later in the program, the audience will have a chance to ask questions. Please use the chat function. That's the button at the bottom of your screen that looks like a speech bubble. On a cell phone, you might see that in the upper right-hand area. Type your question there, and when the time comes, we'll call on you by name to ask your question. So please listen for that. If you're watching this program on Facebook Live, we'll also do our best to relay any questions you may have as well. Now, with all that out of the way, here's our host, UMB Interim President, Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Thank you, Alex, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's also a great pleasure to welcome Professor Larry Gibson on our face-to-face interview. I have known him for the past 23 years and admired him for the many accomplishments he has done, as well as his expertise, perspective, and advice on a wide range of things. I think it's fair to say when he talks, I listen. He's also a fellow artist, and I admire his hobby very much. And any of you who know him know that his passion is photography. And all you have to do is walk through the School of Law to see his photography. So, Professor, thank you for making UMB a better place to work. And as importantly, because of your photography, thank you for making UMB look better as well.
Well, thank you for having me, Mr. President. One good thing I like about universities is they have lots of wall space.
Yes.
I've run out of wall space here, and at Morgan, I'm getting ready to start in on the carpet.
Well, we'll have to find some new walls for you, that's for sure. Although right now, I think we're in the business of trying to tear down walls, aren't we?
Yeah, yes, we are.
At least. So I know that another one of your passions is election law, as well as campaigning. And speaking for myself, I've always thought it was important to vote, but I have to admit that I never had a depth of knowledge around the many issues that surround it, particularly for the African American community. And now add on top of that this pandemic. So I think you and the state of Maryland probably knows more about elections during a pandemic than just about anybody else. We've been through that 3 already this year, is it?
That is correct. We're the only place in the nation who's done that.
That's right. And so I guess let me start out by saying, what have we learned from those experiences, and what are the cautions and what are the strong points?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to be clear. I do not share the criticisms that people have been making about how Maryland has conducted this. I mean, keep in mind that the election officials entered this year assuming this would be a normal electoral process with people showing up at the polling places. And all of a sudden, they were required to conduct 3 in a row, separated by roughly a month between them elections. The first, the 7th Congressional primary election for the 7th Congressional District, and then the general election for the 7th Congressional District, and then the presidential primary. And they had to design the systems and the procedures to be used and to carry them out. And I think they did a remarkable job in the most recent election for municipal offices in Baltimore. We had very, very high turnout. Of course, there were glitches. They moved from one system and had to install a very, very different system that was new to voters, new to the election officials, and new to everyone. And I think, considering all of those factors, they did a fantastic job.
Yeah, we've been learning how to make testing for COVID available more widely in this state. And if there's anything I've learned, it's very difficult to put a new complex system in place and get it to operate without glitches. So I certainly appreciate all that they went through to make that happen. It's a tour de force to do that.
The whole thing is new. As the introduction indicated, I've been at this for about 52 years. And I understand under normal circumstances, with so many moving parts, that it is difficult for candidates and election officials and others to conduct a fair election. But this is different from anything that anyone has seen. Just starting with a candidate campaigns. I mean, we've all been familiar with what's involved in a political campaign, and at the heart of it is shaking hands. And in fact, in elections which I've run, I will often have my candidate on a handshake quota with a campaign assistant nearby with a clicker in his or her pocket, recording the number of handshakes. A successful day may be 500 handshakes, 200, etc. Well, come along this this pandemic and this virus, this principal tool of politics, handshaking, and add to that kissing babies. So so we're already starting with something very new. Add to that a third element of a political campaign: grouping the people, meetings, rallies, events where you bring people together. They could not happen during the course of this pandemic. Add to that other people's events that candidates would normally attend: weddings, anniversaries, alumni events, just of all kinds of that political candidates will come through and again shake hands most often and hopefully speak. Those went by the wayside. And so just being a candidate in the middle of this pandemic has been different. And here again, I compliment the many candidates which I saw, those running for mayor and other local offices, those running for Congress, adapting very quickly to this very unusual circumstance. And as a result, it's made certain other medical tools more important. I think everybody, at least in Maryland, certainly receives enough mailings. I mean, because that's something that a campaign could do. we all saw, of course, many television commercials and the expanded use of social media. So it was new, it was different for the candidates, and as I indicated earlier, very, very different for the election officials.
Do you think it's more expensive to run a campaign during a pandemic?
Well, without a doubt, television is by far the largest budget item of any large campaign. And we set a record here in Baltimore with respect to this mayoral election. The final reports aren't in, but I think we're going to end up showing that $6 million was spent on television in the Baltimore election. I'm sure it's never been in excess of $2 million, and I doubt that it ever reached $2 million, but certainly not any further than any prior election. I don't know the numbers with respect to the mailings, but I would imagine that those budgets were larger. They're candidates from whom I received 6 mailings, and I would imagine other people received that. 4 was kind of the standard. A really heavy mail, direct mailing campaign in the past was deemed to be 4 pieces of mail. But now there's 6, and maybe even people who do more. So I think we're going to find out that those things are much more expensive. But then there's some things that you don't pay for. You don't pay for the expense associated for a big rally because there aren't big rallies. And so there's some trade-offs, but it appears that at least with respect to the municipal elections in Baltimore, particularly the mayor's race, and maybe also a couple of the other races, that we're probably setting records in terms of the amount of money spent.
Yeah, so it's been interesting in this period of teleworking, talking about your campaigning, where we run a whole university or a whole law school or a whole set of programs. We never see anybody in person right now. Everything is remote with a few exceptions. Here you and I are having this conversation, and yet we won't touch each other. We won't do any of those things that ordinarily you associate with personal interactions. And I guess it's hard for me to imagine a campaign route, a campaign, period, a political campaign where it's all done by mail, by TV, by things like this.
That's right. There's no door-to-door. I mean, you run for local office. Certainly, if you're running for city council, you go door to door. Well, door-to-door. That could not happen here. You go another staple of political activity, door to door, person to person handshake. The handshake, as I mentioned earlier, was not possible. It changed it dramatically. Now it'll take some time after this is over, where we'll sit back and figure out what it really meant to have these changes in terms of awareness of the voters and the issues. But we're still in the middle of this, and so haven't had a chance to evaluate it, except to know that it was very, very different.
But it sounds like another part of campaigning is getting to know the community in which you're going to be representing people. And I'm sure some people know their community much more than other people. If you grew up in that community, if you have a lot of connections, seems you're going to be able to represent that group a lot better than if you didn't, given the remote characteristic of not being able to go door to door.
A staple of local politics in Baltimore, and probably many other places, is the realms of the neighborhood associations. Neighborhood associations tend to be apolitical. They don't endorse anyone, but the community movers and shakers tend to be the persons involved in these organizations. Well, that did not happen this spring, and that's the kind of thing that doesn't take place in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, we can continue to make this a pretty long list of just the absence of direct voter contact, direct voter involvement, and it's all at a distance. Well, let's talk about the campaign organization. Campaign staffs would through a normal political campaign have many meetings that last long, that go into the night. They evaluate how things are happening. Well, now they're Zoom meetings. That's certainly what happened with the campaign, which I was mostly directly, which was Congressman Infumi's campaign. We had lots of Zoom meetings, and everybody's on a little place on the screen.
Yeah.
Very, very different. Let me talk about election night. That's the strange one.
Yes.
I mean, election night after he'd won the general election. Normally it's a big party.
Right.
The winning candidate has a big party and people in the media there, and some of the losing candidates will have an event also, and maybe give a concession speech or thank their supporters. Well, here was election night by Infumi. It was at the campaign headquarters. Arrangements were made to social distance the various television cameras. Each had a specified place, 6 feet apart, a particular chair that they could use, and then behind them were the print media and radio media. So everyone is through the room, making about 14 media people or so. So we were guessing about, like, some Las Vegas only 10, but there were about a few. And then before, in front of the cameras, 5 people. I introduced him as the senior advisor to the campaign, the congressman, his wife, and his oldest son. That's it. and guess what? We repeated that again when we had to run again, which was the primary for the full term. And that was a couple of weeks ago. We had an night event that was exactly the same format. It was strange. It was different. I'd never participated in that. Another consequence of the mail voting, rather than in-person voting on election. Well, first of all, it's a misnomer to call it election night. It is just the last night of the election. The election takes place over a couple of weeks soon as the mail ballots arrive. And so it's not election night, it's election ending night. A normal process is you have some good idea of the result. Well, here they released the ballots that had been mailed in and counted. So that was up to about 3 days before the what we call election night, because the election board decided that they would let the ballots sit for a day or so before they would run them through the machine. So the most that you could get was the count up until about 3 or 4 days before the last day. And then they counted, and it went on for a week. So this pandemic has messed up a lot of things, including election night.
Yeah. So I think a lot of us get influenced during an election. If we haven't made up our mind, we get influenced. Well, we have to get influenced at the end if we're going to vote, don't we? So I guess it takes out that sort of spontaneity of my final decision is, and you put the X where it belongs.
Well, I think that last minute events still took place with respect to people who hadn't mailed their ballots. If you mailed your ballot 2 weeks before, that's the only vote that you're going to get. And in this time, with respect to this most recent presidential mayoral election, there were some dramatic events around, the police misconduct matters, and people think that in Maryland and in Baltimore and other places, it affected people's last-minute decision making. Maybe not. But that could happen even in a normal situation where people show up only at
Yes.
the polls. But it makes you wonder whether you should send your ballot in here right away. I still urge people to do so, but there are probably some people who, after they had mailed their ballots, had some development, which said, no, perhaps maybe if I'd had a chance, I'd reconsider this. I don't know.
Yeah, and hence the discussion about when the postmark is in terms of how your ballot counts, because you wouldn't want to wait too late, would you?
Well, that's right. Well, it's postmarked. I guess that's what makes it election day, 8 p.m. On that last day, and we did have the option of in-person voting, and the election officials here in Baltimore were surprised at how many people chose that option. I was out election day. I was surprised at how many people chose to vote in person. 6,000 in Baltimore, even though they had to stand in lines. And the reason he had to stand in lines is the election people guesstimating how many people would show up by what had happened with the first special election primary, where there weren't many people showing up. Didn't have, they underestimated how many people would show up. But I don't blame them that they didn't have any experience except that one primary to go on. And it was odd to me because I talked to some people in line. There were people in line with their mail-in ballots in their hand. And you'd want to say, I did say, why are you doing this? Why are you standing in line? There, at each polling place, there was something they called a drop box, which was a place that you could drop the ballot in the box. And there are people who said, no, I'm accustomed to voting in person. That's what I want to do. And I think the election officials did not anticipate this, and I didn't either. I mean, why would you, if you could just walk up and put the ballot into a box, would you stand in line? But there were hundreds of people in Baltimore who did that.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I remember seeing Hillary Clinton in one of her campaigns, and it was near the end of the campaign, and she looked exhausted and tired. And I was thinking it must be a real ordeal to run for office, an office like that, day in, day out, everything.
I've admired candidates. That's why I stay in the role of campaign advisor, campaign manager. The sacrifices that people undertake to run for office, and so I'm always appreciative of all the candidates, and particularly the people who do not succeed. It is a license for folks to question your motive. It's a license for people to say bad things about you. I'm in awe of folks who put themselves and their family through that. The one redeeming value of it, and one of the reasons that I occasionally get involved in politics, is it does come to an end. You know when the deadline is. And so many things in life just go on, and you want to know when this is over. Well, that's not the case for politics. There is a finite time. There's a finite result. And I guess that's one of the things that I like about it, because then I can go on back to my other things and not be bothered afterwards.
Right. Fascinating way to look at it, but I can see that. So I want to remind the viewers that you can type in questions that you have for Professor Gibson. They can be anonymous, or you can ask it yourself through Alex. So Alex, I see we have a few questions. Why don't you pull one out for the professor?
We do. They're starting to come in now. Let me give you an anonymous one that came in. Should the parties go forward with plans to have big conventions? Does it send the wrong message about how we should be dealing with the pandemic? And since I mentioned that you're a delegate, that's kind of appropriate, right? So you have to decide whether participating in such a thing is the right thing to do.
You are absolutely right. I was elected as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. I was a delegate at the two Bill Clinton conventions. In fact, I was the chair of the Maryland delegation in 1992. But now we have this pandemic. The issue is there really going to be a convention? What is it going to be like? And I have a personal decision to make. Do I go? I'm no spring chicken. And so I'm waiting to see what's happening. We got a memo about 5 days ago about the hotel and our convention hotel, where we would be staying, etc. But I think the party is trying to sort this out. And there are folks like myself who filed as a Biden delegate in December, maybe even November, before there was a pandemic, when it looked like there might even be a contested or broken convention. This is not that at all. This is a coronation. So I'm torn by the fact that voters did vote for me to be a delegate, but there is this bad pandemic, and so that's being sorted out at the convention level, but also I'm trying to figure out what to do. So the question is, what should they do? I don't have an answer to that. I'm more at this point a witness. Watching, and then I'll have some decisions to make personally.
Yeah, that'll be a tough decision. I'd have to think long and hard about that one, I think.
Yes, and Miss Diana is thinking a lot.
Yes.
Since we also.
Yeah. Alex, how about another question?
Well, John Polinsky says he's got a sleeping baby in the room, so I'm going to ask it for him. He's not anonymous, but he wants to keep that baby sleeping. He says, I'd love to hear Professor Gibson's opinion about who might be the best pick as a running mate for Joe Biden, especially given the country's current crises and their impacts on nominating conventions, in-person voting, et cetera. Any thoughts about that?
After the Republicans chose to put Sarah Palin a heartbeat away from the presidency, I concluded that at least, and a large number of Americans voted for the mayor of Wasilla, well, a partial term mayor of Wasilla, Alaska. So there's she lowered the bar such that almost everyone that I've heard mentioned so far is so far superior to that. I've never been good at it, but I'll tell you about one incident that occurred. When President Bill Clinton started running for office, he had a kind of a rocky start, because soon after he announced there was a Jennifer Flowers thing. Well, Mayor Smoke and I decided that we really did like Clinton. And so we invited him to Baltimore because he was really catching a lot of grief in the press. And we had at my house his first fundraiser here in Maryland. At that fundraiser, a friend of mine came up to Bill Clinton and says, "Look, here is my list of who is my suggestion as to who you should pick as your vice president." I learned later that it was Al Gore, who he did chose. And I have this series of photographs where on Clinton's face you can see, oh my Lord, this man knows what I may be thinking. But the conventional wisdom was he would not pick another male Southerner. That was the conventional, that their states were too close together, that this geographical distribution was not right, and that would not happen. After that, and then emphasized further by the choice by McLean of Palin, I am out of prognostications with respect to vice president. Virtually all of the people whom I've heard seriously mentioned who are being vetted would do a good job, and every one of them is light years ahead of the Palin precedent, and probably, well, I would mention another one. So that's going to be ordered. Whomever the president chooses, certainly among the people that he's considering, he can't go wrong.
Gotcha. Alex?
All right, we have Laura Lee. Laura, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, Professor Gibson. Hello. I know you kind of alluded to this on the local level, but I'm curious with COVID-19 and mail-in ballots, the increased number of mail-in ballots. What is your level of confidence in mail-in ballots for the presidential election? And is there a legitimate concern for fraud, as some
the concern that I have is that it appears as if the president is trying to destroy the post office to make the mail-in option not work. Of course, there's been virtually no incidences of mail fraud in mail-in ballots anywhere in the country, hardly at any time. But that's my concern. My concern is that, and the president said it, he says if people vote by mail, Republicans are going to lose. I mean, he said it right up front. So I think we ought to be very careful. I mean, he's now put an operative in as the new head of the Postal Service. The Postal Service is in financial trouble, and I think that they're trying to make it impossible to have a nationwide use of mail-in ballots. And I think that's unfortunate. And I think that people should take action right now to see that that does not succeed.
Wow, that's a big one, isn't it? That one's really heavy.
Yeah, but I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah.
What is happening. And I don't know what folks can do about it, but they should move on it right away. We are in danger of the Postal Service going belly up, and I think a reason that we've had this change at the leadership of the U.S. Postal Service is to allow that to happen, and primarily it's a matter of frustrating voting by mail.
Wow. Wow, Alex, that's really a heavy one.
Hard to follow that, but I think Trish O'Neill will find a way to do it. She's got a couple of questions, a couple of different questions to ask. Tricia, are you there?
Yes. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Personally, I canceled my Airbnb in Milwaukee. Okay, I'm not going. With regard to mail-in ballots and delivering them on the day, election day, I learned from some people that this year they didn't want to touch the machines. And like you, they're pretty wrapped up in the idea of election day. So that was a compromise, is that they didn't have to touch the election machines, but they were still honoring election day by presenting their mail-in ballot that way.
Well, they gave people so many options here. I mean, that's why I'm complimentary of the election officials. People got the ballots about 2 weeks in advance. They could mail them to the U.S. Postal Service. They then installed drop boxes where people could go and mail the ballot. People could show up in person and vote at the polling places they created, or show up and there were drop boxes there. And I noticed, particularly the Everson Village polling place, there was a steady line of people just pulling up to the drop box. I mean, there really is no excuse for anyone not voting, in Baltimore. Now, there's a significant number of people who didn't get ballots because their current address is not the correct address. And there's really been, up until now, no real incentive that people have had to keep the election board up to date as to their changes of address. A lot of people would rather just continue to vote at the old polling place, and so the fact that the mail ballot went to the old address was a big problem. But hopefully that people now understand that if you want to vote, you've got to tell the elections board what your current address is so that the ballot reaches you.
So now for my question, separate from the mail-in ballot information, is I understand that there's a segment of Democrats who are trying to get Vice President Biden to announce his cabinet before the election in order to show the relative youth of his appointees or the progressive nature of his appointees in a way to try and bring together the once 24 candidates' supporters.
I just think that would be foolish on his part. I don't know if any president has ever done that. And so that's my view on that. I mean, there may be someone, I don't think there's any chance he will do it. And I don't think there's any reason that he should.
Yes, Tricia?
Sorry?
Did you have,
trying to goad me? Okay.
Did you have a retort?
Certainly. He's entitled to his opinion. And I recognize that it would be unprecedented. And I think, in my mind, it's not the best idea, just like announcing the vice president too soon, is because it gives people too much time to pick apart the nominees. Because as soon as you put names out there, then the investigative journalists and the muckrakers and all of those folks start to go after those candidates and have a great deal of time before the election to do it. So
but the candidate, but that's when you announce your vice presidential candidate, you've got much more flexibility. But I thought the point was that suggesting that he should announce his cabinet members prior to election. I think that's that makes no sense in my view.
I agree.
Alex, we got another question?
Well, we do. We have a Teresa Pucciarella who says she worked with you for 8 years at the law school, professor, and wanted me to say hello for you. She says, I did use the mail-in ballot and I chose to deliver it in a drop box, but for the November election, I really want my vote to count and will stand in line however long it takes. Should I be concerned about voting by mail? Is my signature really compared to my original voting application? Is this done by a human?
Well, if you want your vote to really count, one way is to drop it in the box before the election day. It'll count either way, whenever you drop it, but it'll count earlier if you drop it in the box. Well, you have probably about a 2-week period. I have no evidence that votes this time weren't counted. There was another part. What was the second? There was another part of the question that I forgot. What's the second?
Oh, is it reviewed by a human, or does somebody really compare signatures? How sure should you be that it really is done right?
This time, the signature review was not really. As long as something was scribbled there, they counted it. There was no rigorous comparison of this signature with anything else.
No hanging Chad problem or anything, huh?
Not on the signature.
Okay.
Probably they wanted something there because there is an affirmation that this is you and you're returning this ballot, etc. And I think it has more to do with the law in terms of perjury. So I think that's what that was about. But there was no comparison, rigorous comparison of the signature on the envelope with anything else.
All right, we have a lot of people who want to remain anonymous today. We have another person in the audience who says, would you ask Professor Gibson what changes he thinks are most important for Maryland to implement in order for the November elections to run more smoothly? What should they be doing?
Well, first of all, I think they ran rather smoothly. We had a statewide congressional presidential election. And I have not heard an awful lot of complaints about this on a statewide basis. There was in Baltimore more people than people anticipated who showed up and wanted to vote in person, even though they had the mail-in problem. There were glitches. There was a councilmatic district where there was a printing error. The printing error did not affect how people voted, but it affected how the ballots would be processed through the machines. And so they lost a day or so on that. And because those ballots had not only the councilmatic race, which was affected by the error, but all the others, it held up things for a day. But considering that this was the first time and that this all had to be prepared on a statewide basis in a matter of a couple of months, I think it went remarkably well. There were some glitches, some things with the printing. The 7 congressional districts and the Baltimore City districts of mailing, because they had to have 3 elections sort of in a row there. The Baltimore City ballots arrived about a week later than they had originally said they were going to arrive. But still, we're talking about 2 weeks arriving 2 weeks prior to that last election day. There will be improvements, but I think the system, in my mind, worked fairly well. I mean, I've been involved in really botched elections. I can think of, you mentioned that first one with respect to Milton Allen, where we didn't know who had won the state's attorney's a race for a couple of weeks, and just massive machine failure and a breakdown. I think of the problems that came when we were using those electronic voting machines. And of course, the problem there is you had no ability to do a recount because there was no paper. There was no paper trail. Well, now we have the paper trail. And I've seen the elections all over the world. I've been involved in a few in other countries, and I can tell you what mismanaged elections look like. We did not have that here in Maryland this time.
Thank you. Alex?
Okay, well, we have an in-person question in a moment. First, one more anonymous question. Person writes, I've heard that new voter registration is lower this year because of the coronavirus, that people are out getting signatures or getting it at the MVA. Who benefits from that? Which party and which kinds of candidates benefit from that?
I don't know what the numbers are on new registrations, but what I do know that in this last election a few weeks ago, we had more first-time voters in primaries. We've always had a higher turnout of people who only vote in the general election. We locally here in Baltimore had a large number, higher than I think we probably ever had, of people voting. When I say first time, the numbers are they hadn't voted in the last 3 primary elections. So something spurred interest in it. As to what's happening with voter registration, I simply don't know. I do know it's a lot easier to do now. You can get the voter registration form over the internet now. I mean, I remember I've conducted voter registration campaigns for decades. And I remember just the process of persuading the boards to print enough voter registration forms and let you have enough to conduct a meaningful voter registration form. You don't even have to do that now. You can just go and download the thing, or have a relative or friend download it for you, over the internet. It's so much easier now to register to vote, to vote, than it used to be. So maybe the problem is that I'm just too old and remember the past, that things are a whole lot better than they used to be.
Alex?
All right, we have Mary Phelan. Mary, what's your question?
Hi, Professor. A friend has a daughter who will be voting for the first time in November, and she's become disheartened about the whole process in light of the recent issues with the primary. What advice would you suggest to boost the confidence in a young first-time voter that voting does matter?
Well, what issues in the primary? I'm not sure what issues in the primary. Well, it's discouraging to her. I got to know what those are.
Just that some people felt that their ballots were not counted, and
Why would they think? I would tell her that that's nonsense. I don't know of any ballots that weren't counted, and it certainly were lots of opportunities to vote. You could start about 3 weeks. No. You could start earlier. You could send the old request for an absentee ballot. That was even weeks earlier. Then they sent this. Imagine this. I never thought I'd ever see this. They actually sent the ballot to everybody for whom they had an address. As a person who has been involved in campaigns for 52 years, I never thought I'd ever see that in my life. They sent a ballot, and you didn't even have to put a stamp on it. So I would tell this first-time voter, sister, this is easy now. Tell me what is complicated about this. They send you the ballot in the mail, and you just fill it in, and you don't even have to put a stamp on the envelope and get it to any place where you mail. It can't get any easier than that.
Yeah. It's made absentee ballot voting very easy, hasn't it? Yes.
What more can they do? Come and interview each person as to who you want to vote for? I mean, what could be easier than they send you? Now, there's states now that are mailing, they're interpreting the mail-in. They'll mail to you an application, and then you have to return the application. Remember our old absentee ballot system? You had to request the ballot. That's happening in some states, and that's one of the techniques that some who want to frustrate voting by mail are going to do. They're going to, rather than just mailing everybody the ballot, they're going to say, well, you've got to ask for the ballot. But here in Maryland, you didn't have to ask for it. It was automatically mailed to you. Nothing could be easier to that. So I say to this young person, vote. There's nothing stopping you from doing so. And don't let anyone convince you that the system was so botched that it's not worth it. There are people who will try to convince you that your ballot didn't count. They'll do lots of things to make you think that it's not worth participating. Don't fall for it.
It's nice not waiting in line. It's nice not getting to work a couple of hours late. There's a lot of nice parts about that. I liked it. Alex, you got some other questions there?
Yes, Mark Dixon has a question about making voting even simpler than that. Mark, are you with us?
Okay.
Mark, go ahead. Oh, Mark, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your time. Is there a reason why in this day and age of 2020, I can pretty much order anything to my doorstep? If you look in my house right now, since the break, my wife has taken plenty of advantages of Amazon and things of that nature. And so my question is, why can't we do voting online? Why can't we do voting via text? It seems like it's a very simple process. I think you focused on, mail-in ballots being easy. I think it's an easier, thing to do than just go online and vote.
For about 10 years now, about every other year, or maybe every year, I have a student write a paper about this. I've been watching the prospect of internet of voting, and it may someday become possible. I understand all the arguments for and the arguments against. The biggest argument against is that the verification processes, but we will someday be there. We will someday be able to do this in a way that preserves the anonymity and that preserves the security. I think we'll get there, but it is so easy to mail now. Why not?
But to rebuttal that, I mean,
what possible argument against mailing it?
Yeah, but my thing is this: if we do our taxes, like I submit my taxes online, and so from a security standpoint, if my taxes can be done essentially via email with my CPA, and he submits everything, or whoever you have submit your things can be done online,
well,
then what's the verification process? What's the safety concern with voting?
Because the absence of the paper trail. The reason that we got rid of our electronic voting machines, we had for about 10 years in Baltimore, in Maryland, these touch-tone machines. And the real heart of the problem with those is, one, they could be hacked. And there was the issue of not having a paper trail. So we went back old school, and Maryland did, and several other states. And I'm glad that they did, that there is a physical piece of paper that each voter has marked on that you can recount, and then that person can be really sure that their vote was counted. That's the trade-off. I understand the arguments. I've read about it. I've studied about it. I've had students write papers about it, and I remember very much. I mean, when we came in with those touch tones, when we switched from the pull levers, the mechanical lever machines, and that was following the 2000 election and those problems. And we went and the hanging chads and all those issues. So we said, okay, no more paper. We're going electronic. But there were obvious problems of just blocks of vote just disappearing, just whole blocks of vote for a click, just vanishing. And that has led many people to go back. I mean, one could say that that's going backwards. We're going back to paper. The whole world is gone paperless. Well, there's something to be said for having the physical document that we can all sit down and recap.
Okay, thank you.
Alex, do you have another question?
Well, I have someone who's written kind of a double question. I want to say it's a two-part, but it's really two different questions. One is, what can we do to drive turnout? And the other is, now, what do you think about what some countries do, which is they have mandatory voting, like Australia?
Well, my thinking on this is different. Now, this may sound odd to you, and it may even seem blasphemy to some of my friends, but I think a person has a right to choose not to vote. I don't like any of the candidates. If there's a race for governor and they're all members of the two leading candidates are members of the Ku Klux Klan, I should have to vote. Or they're all their position is contrary to my thinking on things, I should have to vote. I think people have the right to vote, but people also have, in my view, the right not to vote.
Of course, in the past, you could always write in Pat Paulson or somebody, right?
Hmm?
You could always write in Pat Paulson or someone back in the day. People did that with Dixon.
No,
I'm showing my age.
As someone who's run campaigns and election and urged people to vote, I honestly think that one should have the option to say, I don't want to participate in this process. And what they're doing is they shouldn't then complain about what the government is, because they choose not to pass. And so what they are placing in other people, they're doing is placing in other people's hands to show the selection of the governmental leaders. And so I want to say to that person, don't complain if you don't like the way the government is working, but there are folks who that's their attitude. That I think they should have that freedom.
Alex?
Question just popped up. Mark Dixon, and I don't have time to scroll down to get him, but I'm going to ask his question for him. He said, did someone ask about why we still use the electoral college? That's always a hot topic.
It's impossible to amend the Constitution to change it. Change the Constitution. There are enough states who benefited from it, who get far more clout than they otherwise would have. And so we still have the electoral college because it's in the U.S. Constitution. And I don't see any prospect of there becoming enough states to record as the states that would be necessary to amend the Constitution. So that's why
some people say if you had a constitutional convention, you could have, a swap. If your state goes for this, my state can go for that. I've heard that talked about.
Well, maybe so. It's the same reason that we have our undemocratic Senate. The Senate is highly. I imagine that the handful of people that live in North Dakota have 2 senators as a comparison with the millions and millions of people who live in California and New York, etc. It's an inherently undemocratic body, but those are our inheritances from the founding of this country, and some of them we just end up living with. Why can't Baltimore tax the thousands of people who every work day come into Baltimore, use the resources here, make their life living, and then go out of Baltimore in one of the neighboring counties and not pay Baltimore taxes, and actually go out badmouthing Baltimore and come back in the next day because the reality is the votes aren't there within the city to deal with that gross injustice.
So, Professor, we have 2 minutes left. And so I wanted to take the privilege of asking you just to describe to people about the parade you had planned on March or May 15th that I was going to be with you in, and it disappeared.
Yes, you were going to be one of the. Look, in 1870, there was the ratification of the 15th Amendment, giving blacks the right to vote. The largest celebration of that occurred in Baltimore. The national celebration. It was a massive event. 10,000 people participated, and that was May the 19th, 1870. And we had planned, and the plans were moving along pretty well to reenact that event. President Jarrell was one of the reenactors, the dean of our law school. There were lots of other people. It was going to be a glorious event. But I've stopped feeling terrible. After they canceled the Major League Baseball, all the plays on Broadway, the whole Vegas Strip shut down, and March Madness, I said, well, in comparison with those things killed off by the pandemic, I guess I'll have to live with the cancellation of a reenactment of this 1870 parade.
But we'll get it back. But I'm telling you, I want to come as a blacksmith, not as a city elder.
Yeah, but you were portraying. Who were you portraying? It was.
I don't remember, but somebody not like me. I'm sure I wanted to come.
No. I remembered your character. I don't remember right now. But no, we've been talking about some virtual stuff, but they've been all these virtual things, and we're open the possibility of maybe doing something in October. So it's not totally off the board. I've returned everybody's money.
Don't make me ride a horse. How about that? Okay.
Well, I won't. But we had lined up horses and carriages. It was the largest assembly. I mean, we went all over Washington and Virginia, etc. Lined up horses and carriages because there weren't automobiles. We're going to have 2 parts. The 1870 part with horses and carriages, and then the back part, the women's right to vote, that's 100 years. The automobile, that was 1920, had been invented. So we had lined up all of these 1920 vintage cars. I mean, the arrangements were all in place, and then this pandemic comes, and it just screwed up a whole lot of things, didn't it?
It sure did. Well, I want to thank you very, very much. This was a most enjoyable hour for me. It's such a pleasure to see your beautiful face, to be on this discussion. I look forward to continuing it. I want to thank those of you who were participants in the audience, and look forward to the next one. So, Professor Gibson, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.